The sudden death of Joseph Stalin in the spring of 1934 from a catastrophic cerebral hemorrhage did not trigger an immediate collapse of the Soviet state. Instead, it created a seismic power vacuum at its very apex, a void so profound and dangerous that it threatened to tear the entire Bolshevik project apart. Stalin did not leave a designated successor. He had spent a decade ensuring that no single rival could ever amass enough influence to challenge him. His death, therefore, did not end the political struggle. It merely unleashed it. The man who had perfected the art of playing his subordinates against one another was gone, and the stage was set for a brutal, behind-the-scenes battle for the soul of the world's first communist state. The initial response to the news, broadcast across the nation with somber music and declarations of national mourning, was one of orchestrated unity. A collective leadership, a troika, was swiftly formed to manage the transition and, more importantly, to prevent any one figure from seizing control. This triumvirate consisted of the three most powerful men in the party after Stalin, each representing a different power base and a distinct vision for the USSR's future. First was Sergei Kirov, the charismatic and popular party boss of Leningrad. Kirov was seen as a potential reformer. He was a man of the people, a powerful orator who genuinely connected with the rank-and-file party members. At the recent 17-party Congress, the Congress of Victors, he had received a standing ovation that rivaled Stalin's, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the paranoid General Secretary. In this new timeline, Kirov enters the Troika not as a martyr assassinated by Stalin's orders, but as a leading contender for ultimate power. His platform was one of relative moderation, potentially easing the worst excesses of forced collectivization and seeking a broader coalition within the party. The second pillar of the Troika was Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's loyal right hand and chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. Molotov was the ultimate apparatchik, a diligent, hard-working, and ideologically rigid bureaucrat. He was the embodiment of the system Stalin had built, ruthless, uncompromising, and dedicated to the principle of centralized state control at any cost. Without Stalin, Molotov positioned himself as the guardian of orthodoxy, the man who would ensure that the General Secretary's hardline policies, particularly the breakneck pace of industrialization, would continue unabated. He commanded the loyalty of the state bureaucracy and the older, more conservative Bolshevik Guard. The third and most dangerously cunning member was Genrikh Yagoda, the head of the NKVD, the dreaded secret police. Yagoda controlled the regime's instrument of terror. He held the files, the informants, the prisons, and the execution squads. His power was not based on popularity or ideological purity, but on fear and blackmail. In the Troika, Yagoda was the wild card. He ostensibly supported the collective leadership, but his ultimate allegiance was to himself and the expansion of the NKVD's influence into every facet of Soviet life. He saw the power vacuum not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to be exploited. The first months of the Troika's rule were a delicate dance of public collaboration and private maneuvering. Kirov, leveraging his popularity, began pushing for a policy of Soviet legality, a subtle but significant shift away from the arbitrary terror of the Stalin years. He argued that the revolution was secure, that the party had defeated its internal enemies, and that it was time to rein in the NKVD and foster a more positive, inclusive spirit to mobilize the population for the coming challenges, particularly the threat from a rearming Nazi Germany. Molotov vehemently opposed this. He saw any relaxation of control as a fatal weakness. In Politburo meetings, he would clench his fist and argue, "We are surrounded by wolves. To show mercy is to invite destruction." The policies of Joseph Vissarionovich made us strong. To deviate from them is betrayal. He found a natural, if uneasy, ally in Yagoda. The NKVD chief had no desire to see his power curtailed by Kirov's legality. He and Molotov formed a tacit pact to block Kirov's more moderate initiatives. Yagoda, meanwhile, was playing a deeper game. He used the NKVD's vast surveillance apparatus to gather compromat on his rivals. He knew about Molotov's wife's impending arrest, which Stalin had planned, and he held on to that information as a future weapon. He also monitored Kirov's supporters, building dossiers on figures like Zhdanov and Khrushchev, who were aligning themselves with the Leningrad leader. The Soviet Union, in this period, became a state of three competing centers of power: Kirov's party apparatus, Molotov's state bureaucracy, and Yagoda's security empire. The fundamental question that the Troika grappled with, and which would define the future of the USSR, was how to deal with the legacy of Stalinism. The Great Purge, which in our history decapitated the Red Army, eliminated intellectual and cultural life, and instilled a paralyzing fear throughout society, had not yet begun in earnest. Without Stalin's personal vendettas and pathological suspicion to drive it forward, the machinery of mass terror stalled. The show trials of Zinoviev and Kamenev were postponed indefinitely. The military command, including brilliant strategists like Marshal Tukhachevsky, remained in their posts, watching the political struggle in the Kremlin with bated breath. By late 1935, the fragile balance of the Troika was beginning to fracture. Kirov, frustrated by the constant obstruction from Molotov and Yagoda, began to appeal directly to the broader Central Committee, where his support was strongest. He spoke of the need for a new course, for a leadership that reflected the will of the party masses. This was a direct challenge to the closed-door, secretive rule of the Troika. The climax of this chapter in Soviet history was not a single assassination, but a political coup at a Central Committee plenum. Kirov, with the backing of the military and regional party bosses who were weary of the terror and economic hardship, tabled a motion to formally curtail the NKVD's extrajudicial powers and to reaffirm the principle of collective leadership. In a tense, closed-door session, with the threat of military intervention looming in the background, Kirov prevailed. Yagoda, his power base undermined, was removed as head of the NKVD and replaced by a less ambitious operative. Molotov, isolated, was forced to concede. The rise of the Troika ended not with a bang, but with a political resolution. Sergei Kirov emerged as the first secretary of the Communist Party, a first among equals. The Soviet Union he now led was fundamentally different from the one Stalin would have forged. It was a state still authoritarian and repressive, but one where the worst excesses of the terror had been averted. The Red Army was intact, the intellectual class was not decimated, and a semblance of party democracy had been restored. This new USSR, stronger in some ways, yet untested in the fires of a Great Purge, now had to turn its gaze westward, where the drums of war were beginning to beat. The vacuum in the Kremlin had been filled, but the true test of this new leadership was yet to come. In our history, the period from 1936 to 1938 is known in the Soviet Union as the Yezhovshchina, the Great Purge. Its most catastrophic single blow was delivered against the heart of the nation's defense, the Red Army. In a series of secret trials and swift, brutal executions, the military leadership was systematically decapitated. Marshals, generals, and colonels, veterans of the Civil War and pioneers of modern military theory, were branded as traitors and spies, their expertise liquidated in the basements of the NKVD. Of the 101 high-ranking officers on the military Soviet, 91 were arrested and most were shot. This self-inflicted wound left the Red Army a headless giant, commanded by politically reliable but often incompetent juniors, a weakness that Nazi Germany would exploit with devastating effect in the initial stages of Operation Barbarossa. But in this alternate timeline, where Stalin's death in 1934 preempts this madness, the story of the Red Army diverges radically. The Great Purge was not an inevitable historical force. It was the product of one man's paranoia, enabled by a terror apparatus he commanded absolutely. Without Stalin, the engine of the purge lacked its malevolent spark. The Troika that succeeded him, particularly after Kirov's political victory and the sidelining of the ambitious NKVD chief Yagoda, had neither the unity nor the ideological fervor to initiate such a self-destructive campaign. The survival of the Red Army's officer corps became the single most significant military consequence of Stalin's premature death. The man who came to personify this salvation was Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky. In our world, Marshal Tukhachevsky was the archetypal victim of the Purge, a brilliant, visionary commander executed on fabricated charges of a military fascist plot. In this new world, he remained not only alive, but ascendant. Appointed People's Commissar for Defense by a Kirov-led government that valued competence over sycophancy, Tukhachevsky was unleashed. He was a proponent of deep battle theory, a sophisticated operational doctrine that envisioned breaking through enemy fronts with coordinated, massive assaults by tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry, then exploiting those breakthroughs to paralyze and shatter the enemy's entire strategic depth. Under Stalin, his theories were often stifled, his ambitious modernization plans curtailed by suspicion and a preference for sheer, brute force numbers. Now, with the political backing he had long been denied, Tukhachevsky initiated a revolution within the Red Army. The doctrinal debates that had once been academic became the foundation of a new military field manual. The T-26 and BT series tanks, which in our history were often poorly maintained and operated by inexperienced crews, became the core of a newly formed professional armored corps. Tukhachevsky understood that tanks were not mere infantry support vehicles, but the spearhead of a new kind of mobile warfare. He championed the development and mass production of the T-34 tank years earlier than in our timeline, recognizing its revolutionary design as the perfect instrument for his deep battle concepts. The survival of the officer corps had a cascading effect on every branch of the military. The Air Force, or VVS, retained commanders like Yakov, Smushkevich, and Pavel Rychagov, who understood the critical importance of air superiority and ground attack coordination. They pushed for the development of more advanced fighter aircraft and improved radio communication between pilots and ground forces, a critical weakness in the historical Red Air Force of 1941. In the Signal Corps, logistics, and engineering branches, experienced officers remained at their posts. This meant that the complex combined arms operations envisioned by deep battle doctrine could be planned, communicated, and executed with a level of professionalism that the purged Red Army of 1941 could never have managed. This is not to say the Soviet military of the late 1930s became an invincible, perfectly oiled machine. It still faced immense challenges. The rapid expansion of the armed forces meant a dilution of quality. Many junior officers and conscripts were still poorly educated and trained. The sheer scale of rearmament created logistical nightmares and teething problems with new equipment. Political commissars still existed, maintaining party control, though their power to countermand military orders was significantly curtailed under Tukhachevsky's reforms. The army was in a state of turbulent, often chaotic transformation. But it was a transformation led by its best and brightest, not its most servile. The true test of this reformed Red Army came not against Germany, but in the East. The Soviet-Japanese border conflicts, which culminated in the Battle of Kok-and-Jeol in 1939, served as a brutal live-fire exercise. In our history, this battle was a brilliant but localized victory masterminded by General Georgy Zhukov. In this timeline, Zhukov, another survivor of the non-purge, operated with even greater freedom and resources. The Japanese Guandong Army faced not just a talented commander, but a fully realized application of deep battle theory on a smaller scale. Soviet armored units, operating with better coordination and more aggressive initiative, achieved an even more decisive and devastating encirclement. The lesson was clear. The Red Army, when properly led and equipped, was a formidable, modern fighting force. By the dawn of the 1940s, the Soviet Union that Adolf Hitler would look upon with predatory ambition was a different strategic entity altogether. The Wehrmacht's intelligence assessments, which in our history rightly concluded the Red Army was a colossus with feet of clay, would now have to be radically revised. They would note a cohesive, experienced high command. They would observe large, well-equipped armored formations training under a unified and advanced doctrine. They would see an air force with veteran leadership. The element of surprise would remain, but the element of catastrophic Soviet weakness, the decapitation of its command structure, was gone. The survival of its officer corps meant that when the storm of war finally broke, the Colossus would not stumble. It would turn, with a clear head and a sharpened sword, to face the onslaught. The thwarting of the Great Purge did not guarantee victory, but it guaranteed a fight far different from the historical catastrophe of 1941. The period following the consolidation of Kirov's leadership and the preservation of the military's intellectual core was not merely one of recovery, but of radical, aggressive modernization. The Soviet Union of the late 1930s became a laboratory for military science, its doctrines and technologies evolving at a pace that would have been unimaginable under the stifling paranoia of Stalin's rule. The Red Army was not just avoiding a purge. It was actively being rebuilt in the image of its most forward-thinking commanders. This chapter delves into the concrete transformations that forged a different Red Army, one defined by the triumvirate of unified doctrine, technological prioritization, and professional initiative. The cornerstone of this transformation was the official and wholesale adoption of the deep operation, Glubokaya Operatsiya, doctrine. Under Marshal Tukhachevsky's relentless drive, what was once a controversial theory debated in military academies became the bedrock of Red Army field regulations. The doctrine was a symphony of destruction, demanding the precise coordination of all arms, infantry, artillery, armor, and air power, to achieve a single goal: the total collapse of the enemy's defensive front. The first echelon would breach the tactical zone, but unlike the blunt, costly frontal assaults of the past, this breach was designed to be exploited immediately by powerful, independent mobile groups. These groups, composed of tank brigades and motorized rifle divisions, would not turn to engage bypass strongpoints. Their mission was audacious: to drive deep into the enemy's rear, seizing command centers, logistics hubs, and airfields, dislocating the entire enemy operational system and rendering its frontline units isolated and paralyzed. This required a fundamental shift in mindset from attrition to maneuver, from grinding the enemy down to systematically dismantling their ability to fight. This doctrinal revolution demanded a parallel revolution in technology and force structure. Tukhachevsky, with the support of a government fearful of the German threat, wielded the USSR's burgeoning industrial might like a scalpel. The armored forces were completely reorganized. The scattered tank battalions, tasked primarily with infantry support, were dissolved. In their place stood newly formed tank corps, and later, even more powerful mechanized corps. These were combined arms formations in their own right, built around a core of hundreds of tanks, and including integral motorized infantry, self-propelled artillery, reconnaissance units, and combat engineers. They were designed not to support the infantry, but to operate independently as the spearhead of the deep operation. This shift in doctrine directly influenced equipment design and production. The T-34, a design that faced significant political hurdles in our timeline, was fast-tracked into mass production. Its combination of sloped armor, powerful gun, and wide tracks made it the ideal instrument for deep battle, fast, survivable, and lethal. Similarly, the KV-1 heavy tank was prioritized to act as a breakthrough vehicle for the initial assaults. The Army also invested heavily in the tools of communication and coordination, the oft-neglected nervous system of a modern military. Radio sets were installed not just in command tanks, but down to platoon level, a luxury the historical Red Army of 1941 did not have. This allowed for the real-time coordination and fluid command that mobile warfare demanded. The Air Force, the VVS, was also reformed, with a greater emphasis on ground attack aircraft like the Ilyushin IL, two Sturmovik and fighter bombers to provide close air support for the advancing mobile groups, acting as flying artillery. Perhaps the most profound and most intangible change was in the culture of command. The purge that never was meant that the principle of Edinonacally, single command, was reinforced. While political commissars remained to ensure the political reliability of the armed forces, their power to veto military orders was drastically reduced. Commanders were expected to be experts in their craft, and they were granted a significant degree of initiative, the ability to make swift decisions on the battlefield without waiting for orders from a distant, micromanaging headquarters. This was a direct antidote to the rigid, often paralyzing control that would characterize the Soviet command style in the early war years of our history. The Soviet-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940, the Winter War, served as a brutal but invaluable testing ground for this new army. The initial assaults, while still facing the tenacious Finnish defense, were executed with greater coordination and flexibility. Commanders like Zhukov and Konyev, learning from early setbacks, were able to adapt their tactics, using their mobile groups more effectively to outflank and isolate stubborn strongpoints like the Mannerheim Line. The war was still a costly and difficult struggle, but it did not expose the same level of catastrophic incompetence as it did in our timeline. Instead, it served as a harsh lesson that was quickly absorbed and acted upon. The reforms were accelerated, tactical deficiencies were addressed, and the army emerged from the snows of Finland bloodied, but far more confident and experienced. By June 1941, the Red Army poised on the western frontier was a force of a different character. It was not a perfect army. It still suffered from the logistical complexities of its massive expansion, and many of its junior officers were green. But its core was solid. It possessed a unified and modern doctrine, a large and growing fleet of world-class tanks, a command structure rich with veteran talent, and a culture that, while still authoritarian, encouraged professional competence and tactical initiative. When German reconnaissance planes flew over the border regions, they did not see a disorganized and decapitated force. They saw well-organized troop concentrations, large formations of tanks practicing complex maneuvers, and a military infrastructure that was being built with a clear, offensive-minded purpose. This was the different Red Army, a force that had been reformed and modernized not in the crucible of catastrophic defeat, but in the tense, proactive years of a reprieve it was never meant to have. The Wehrmacht was still the most battle-hardened army in the world, but it was no longer preparing to kick in a rotten door. It was sharpening its sword for a clash of titans. From a moment Adolf Hitler consolidated power in Germany, the Soviet Union viewed the Nazi state as its ultimate ideological and geopolitical antagonist. The rise of a militaristic, expansionist, and virulently anti-communist regime on its western border represented an existential threat. In our timeline, Stalin's response to this threat was a paradoxical and ultimately catastrophic blend of cynical realpolitik and profound self-delusion, culminating in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He believed he could buy time and redirect Hitler's aggression westward, all while his own military was being systematically gutted by his purges. In the alternate reality of a post-Stalin USSR, the Soviet approach to the Nazi menace was fundamentally different, shaped by a more pragmatic leadership and a military command that understood the true nature of the coming storm. The central question for the Kremlin became, were they facing a weakened Soviet Union, vulnerable to German aggression, or could they forge a united front to contain the Nazi threat? The person of Stalin himself was a massive obstacle to any potential alliance with the West. His paranoia, his record of betraying allies, and the sheer ideological revulsion he inspired in London and Paris made genuine military cooperation nearly impossible. The Western democracies deeply distrusted the Soviet dictator, and the feeling was mutual. With Stalin gone and the more pragmatic, if still ideologically committed, Sergei Kirov at the helm, the diplomatic calculus shifted. Kirov and his foreign minister, Maxim Litvinov, were proponents of collective security. Litvinov, a skilled diplomat who was married to an Englishwoman, had long argued for a firm alliance with Britain and France to deter Hitler. Without Stalin's constant suspicion and his parallel, secret negotiations with the Germans, Litvinov's policy was given a real chance to succeed. Throughout the mid to late 1930s, Soviet diplomacy was therefore more consistent and outwardly focused. The USSR loudly condemned German rearmament and the remilitarization of the Rhineland. It provided more substantial aid to the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War, seeing it not just as an ideological struggle, but as a critical battlefield against the spread of fascism. Most importantly, it engaged seriously in the tripartite negotiations with Britain and France in the summer of 1939. In our history, these talks were a farce. The British and French delegations had no real authority to commit to a treaty, and Stalin was already secretly dealing with Hitler. Here, the Soviet position was both more credible and more forceful. Marshal Tukhachevsky and the General Staff provided a powerful military backbone to these diplomatic efforts. They presented the British and French military attaches with detailed, realistic plans for a coordinated response to German aggression. They argued that in the event of a German attack on Poland, the Red Army, strong, unified, and led by its most competent commanders, could immediately commit over 100 divisions to a counteroffensive in the east. This was not the hollow boast of a crippled army, but the serious proposition of a military high command confident in its own capabilities. The survival of the Polish state was, for the Soviets, a critical strategic buffer. A united front with the West was the most logical and desirable outcome. However, the deep-seated antipathy of the Western powers towards communism proved an almost insurmountable barrier. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government in Britain remained profoundly skeptical. The Poles themselves, having fought the Soviets for their independence only 2 decades prior, refused outright to grant the Red Army permission to operate on their territory, fearing, not without reason, that the Soviets would never leave. The talks stalled on this fundamental point of distrust. Yet, without Stalin's secret backchannel to Berlin, the collapse of the tripartite talks did not automatically lead to a pact with the Nazis. The Soviet leadership, particularly Kirov and the military, viewed Hitler with unvarnished hostility. They understood that a deal with the Nazi regime was a pact with the devil, a temporary respite at best. Consequently, the summer of 1939 reached a dramatic and tense impasse. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, with its secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe, was never signed. The Nazi and Soviet empires faced each other directly, without the fig leaf of a non-aggression treaty. For Hitler, this presented a severe strategic dilemma. His entire plan for the invasion of Poland, and subsequently for the war in the West, was predicated on securing his eastern flank. He could not risk a two-front war from the very beginning. The Wehrmacht High Command, which in our history was nervous but acquiescent to the invasion of Poland, would have been apoplectic at the prospect of a full-scale, unpurged Red Army looming in the east. This does not mean war was averted. Hitler's ambitions were limitless. It does, however, radically alter its timing and opening moves. The most likely scenario is a delayed and altered conflict. Hitler might still have gambled on a quick knockout blow against Poland, hoping that the Soviets would not intervene immediately or that the West would still dither. But this would have been an astronomically higher risk. Alternatively, he might have turned his focus first to the West, attempting to force a rapid capitulation of France before dealing with the Soviet colossus, all while leaving a massive defensive force in the East, a reversal of his historical strategy. The world, therefore, did not awake on September 1st, 1939, to a neatly partitioned Poland and a world war begun by a German-Soviet conspiracy. Instead, it hovered on the brink of a much more ideologically clear-cut and strategically precarious conflict. The Soviet Union was not a co-conspirator with the Nazis, but a wary, armed neutral, a potential enemy to Germany and a reluctant, distrusted potential ally to the West. The Nazi menace now faced a continental puzzle where the Eastern peace did not fit neatly into place. The USSR was neither clearly weakened nor part of a formal united front. It was a wild card, a powerful, rearmed, and hostile state whose actions in the opening moments of the war would now decide the fate of Europe. The initiative had subtly shifted. Hitler was no longer the sole architect of the war's opening act. He would have to look over his shoulder toward the east and wonder not if the Red Army would strike, but when. The outbreak of the Second World War in this altered timeline was not a single definitive event, but a cascading series of crises, each reshaping the alliances and military strategies of the European powers. Without the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to provide a temporary and cynical peace, the continent descended into a period of violent uncertainty, a war of patriotic confusion, where old enmities and new realities clashed, and the path of the conflict was anything but preordained. The opening act of this global drama would be fundamentally rewritten, dictated by the strategic calculus of a rearmed and confident Soviet Union and the desperate gambles of a Nazi Germany denied its secure eastern flank. The trigger remained the same: Adolf Hitler's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. But the response was not. In our history, Britain and France declared war on Germany, while the Soviet Union waited 2.5 weeks before invading Poland from the east, sealing its fate under the terms of the secret protocol. Here, there was no such protocol. The Soviet Union, under Khrushchev, issued immediate and vehement condemnation of the Nazi aggression. More importantly, it began a full, emergency mobilization of its Western military districts. The Red Army, already at a higher state of readiness than in our timeline, moved to its forward positions along the Polish border not as an invader, but as a potential counterpuncher. The world watched, holding its breath. Would the USSR honor its rhetorical commitments and intervene? The decision in the Kremlin was fraught. An immediate declaration of war against Germany would fulfill the spirit of collective security, but would thrust the USSR into a major war for which it was still preparing. It would also mean propping up the Polish government, a historical adversary that still refused transit rights for the Red Army. The debate was fierce. The military, led by Tukhachevsky, argued for a swift, limited intervention. Their plan was not to conquer Poland, but to engage and destroy the overextended Wehrmacht formations within it before they could consolidate their gains. This would rescue a rump Polish state, create a buffer, and bleed the German war machine from day one. The more cautious political elements feared the immense cost and the prospect of facing the full might of the Wehrmacht alone if the West failed to launch a meaningful offensive. The result was a compromise, one that defined the chaotic early phase of the war. The Soviet Union did not formally declare war on Germany in September 1939. Instead, as the Polish resistance crumbled and the German armies pushed deep into the country, the USSR issued an ultimatum to both Germany and the collapsing Polish state. Citing the need to restore order and prevent the total annihilation of the Polish people, and invoking the threat to its own security, the Red Army crossed the border on September 17th, not as an ally of Germany, but as a third, independent force. Their stated goal was to establish a defensive line along the Vistula River, effectively cutting the German conquest in half. The ensuing weeks were a maelstrom of confused and brutal fighting. Advancing Soviet mechanized corps collided with victorious, but exhausted, German panzer divisions. For the first time, the Wehrmacht faced an enemy with comparable, and in some cases superior, tank technology and a doctrine of deep battle that mirrored their own blitzkrieg. The battles around Lublin and Brest-Litovsk were not the one-sided mop-up operations of our history, but fierce, meeting engagements between two modern armies. The Germans, masters of tactical improvisation, inflicted heavy losses on the Soviets. But the Soviets, with their numerical advantage in armor and deeper operational reserves, held their ground. By early October, a tense, de facto front line stabilized, running roughly through the center of Poland. Germany held the west, the USSR held the east, and both armies glared at each other across a shattered no-man's land. This new reality shattered the existing alliance structures. There was no formal alliance between the USSR and the West, but de facto one was born of necessity. Britain and France, while deeply uneasy about the Soviet occupation of eastern Poland, had no choice but to welcome this new, powerful enemy of their enemy. Lend-Lease discussions began tentatively, with the Western allies now seeing the USSR as the continental bulwark against Hitler they had always hoped for. For Germany, it was a strategic nightmare realized, a two-front war from the very beginning. The phony war in the West was anything but phony now. Hitler could not transfer the bulk of his forces to attack France, as he had to keep his most experienced divisions in the East to contain the Soviet threat. The war's subsequent trajectory diverged radically. The German invasion of France in the spring of 1940, if it occurred at all, would have been a much riskier undertaking with a significant portion of the Luftwaffe and the Army's best units tied down in Poland. It is plausible that the Battle of France would have been a far more protracted and costly affair, or perhaps even a stalemate. Alternatively, Hitler, enraged by the Soviet intervention, might have turned the full fury of the Wehrmacht eastward first, launching a 1940 version of Barbarossa against a Soviet Union that was not caught by surprise, but already mobilized and deployed along a front line it had chosen. This war of patriotic confusion lacked the clear, unifying narrative of the Great Patriotic War. For the Soviet soldier, it was not a straightforward defense of the motherland from a treacherous invasion. It was a complex war fought on foreign soil, initially to shape the geopolitical landscape, and later for sheer survival against the full force of the German military. The command structure, however, functioned with an efficiency unknown in our 1941. Tukhachevsky, as de facto supreme commander, coordinated the fronts with a professional grasp of operational art. Zhukov, Konyev, and Rokossovsky commanded armies and fronts, their talents honed in the border conflicts and the Polish intervention, not buried in NKVD prisons. They learned from their tactical mistakes in 1939 and adapted. When a main German onslaught eventually came, as it inevitably would, the Red Army would be bloodied, experienced, and led by a unified, confident command. They would not be surprised in their barracks, but deployed in battle formations, ready for the fight of their lives. The confusion of the war's origins would soon be washed away in the clarity of a struggle for existence. But the Soviet Union would enter that struggle on a footing far more equal to its foe. The conclusion of the Second World War in this alternate timeline was not marked by the same stark, symbolic division as in our own. There was no V-Day photograph of Soviet and American soldiers meeting at the Elbe, for the Elbe River lay deep within a German state that still existed, albeit in a crippled form. There was no race for Berlin because Berlin had fallen not to a single climactic siege, but had been captured in a coordinated pincer movement by Western Allied and Soviet forces, a brutal and costly operation that cemented their military alliance until the very end. The peace that settled over Europe in the late 1940s was fragile and complex, a patchwork of spheres of influence rather than a continent brutally split by an iron curtain. The absence of Stalin's pathological suspicion and expansionist ambition, combined with a Soviet Union that had fought as a respected ally from the beginning, created a profoundly different post-war order. The war's endgame was dictated by the military realities of 1944 to 45. The Western Allies, having established a solid foothold in France, pushed eastward. The Soviet Union, having bled the German war machine white in a massive, continuous front stretching from the Baltic to the Balkans, advanced westward. The two armies did not meet in a chaotic scramble for territory, but along a pre-negotiated demarcation line, roughly following the Oder River in the north and cutting through a defeated Austria in the south. This line was not an impenetrable border. It was a temporary military boundary for disarmament and stabilization. Germany was partitioned, but into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet. The key difference was the context. The Soviet zone was not an isolated, walled-off prison camp, but part of a coordinated, if tense, Allied administration for a defeated nation. The city of Berlin, deep within the Soviet zone, was similarly quartered, but without the subsequent Berlin blockade, the city remained a functioning, if occupied, entity. The political landscape of post-war Europe was shaped by this less antagonistic beginning. The United Nations, formed in 1945, did not become an immediate arena for superpower proxy fights. The Soviet delegation, led by pragmatic diplomats rather than Stalinist ideologues, engaged more constructively. Without a Stalin to demand absolute subservience, The nations of Eastern Europe experienced a different kind of liberation. Countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary were not subjected to the immediate and brutal imposition of one-party communist rule. They fell within the Soviet sphere of influence, yes, and the Red Army's presence was a powerful political fact. But the process was more gradual and political. Socialist and communist parties competed in genuinely contested, though heavily influenced, elections. Coalition governments were formed, and for a few years, a semblance of political pluralism persisted in the people's democracies, much to the frustration of the more hardline elements in Moscow, but tolerated by a leadership that prioritized stability and reconstruction over ideological purity. The single greatest symbol of this alternate world was the fate of Germany. There was no Berlin Wall. There was no Federal Republic of Germany and German Democratic Republic as two hostile, separate states. Instead, after a decade of joint occupation and arduous negotiation, a unified, neutral, and demilitarized German state was re-established in 1955. This was the grand bargain of the post-war era. The West secured a Germany that would not be a Soviet satellite, and the USSR secured a Germany that would not be a rearmed member of NATO. The new Germany, with its capital in Frankfurt, became a neutral buffer state, its economy and politics a blend of social democracy and regulated capitalism, forever forbidden from hosting foreign troops or maintaining a significant military beyond a small defense force. It was an imperfect and unstable solution, but it kept a unified Germany in the heart of Europe without triggering a new war. This did not mean the world was free of conflict. The Cold War still developed, but it was a cooler, more diplomatic Cold War. The ideological struggle between capitalism and communism continued, but it was fought in boardrooms, at scientific conferences, and in the proxy wars of Asia and Africa, not with tanks poised across the Fulda Gap. The nuclear arms race occurred, but without the same apocalyptic urgency. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, never happened. A less paranoid Soviet leadership had no reason to place missiles so provocatively close to the American mainland, preferring to maintain a deterrent based on its own territory and a fleet of ballistic missile submarines. The cultural and human consequences were immense. A European community formed, as in our timeline, but it included, from its inception, the neutral states of Central Europe like Czechoslovakia and Hungary. The flow of people, ideas, and culture across the continent was never completely severed. The rich intellectual and artistic life of cities like Prague, Warsaw, and Budapest was not strangled by isolation and censorship. They remained vibrant, if poorer, parts of the European cultural mainstream. The fate of Europe without the Iron Curtain was not a utopia. It was a continent still scarred by war, still divided by ideology, and still living under the shadow of nuclear weapons. But it was a continent of connections, not divisions. It was a Europe where the wounds of war had a chance to heal without the constant picking of a concrete and ideological wall. The long, dark night of totalitarian oppression for half of Europe was replaced by a twilight of limited sovereignty and constrained freedom. A flawed and compromised peace, but a peace nonetheless. The death of one man in 1934 had not prevented a world war, but it had irrevocably altered its conclusion, sparing millions the grim fate of life behind a wall, and leaving a continent whole, free, and forever wrestling with the complex legacy of a war that ended not with a division, but with a difficult, negotiated embrace.